there's a chapter in the book that goes through the experience of a soldier, Sergeant Trimmingham. He had been stationed in Arizona, and he belonged to a black division. And in Arizona, they were the pride of the state. They got positive press coverage all of the time. Arizona was very proud of its soldiers. He was sent on a mission to the Deep South on Army business. And so he took a train, he arrived, I believe he was in Louisiana, and he finished his Army business, he needed to get back on the train and go back to Arizona. So he went to a lunchroom before his train left, and he asked if he could just have some coffee and something to eat. And they said, you have to eat it in the kitchen. And he went to the kitchen, and there was one of those windows in the door, so he could see out into the dining room. And then he watched as a group of German POWs were brought into the dining room, and they were allowed to sit. And they smoked, and he said it looked like they were having quite a good time. And so as he watched, he ended up writing a letter to Yank the Army Weekly, a letter to the editor, and he said, I would like to know why enemies of the United States are treated better than its own soldiers. And I would like to know, because the Army had all of this stuff about why we fight, right? Frank Capra put together a series called Why We Fight. So the Army was really interested in letting people know why you're fighting. You're fighting for these good principles. So he said, I would like to know, what am I fighting for? And he said, I think all of the black troops in the Army would like to know that as well. And then he said, I dare you to print this letter. Well, Yank printed the letter. And by the way, when FDR dedicated Yank, he said, I'm looking forward to reading every issue cover to cover. So when you wrote a letter and it got published in Yank, it wasn't just the Army that you were talking to. Politicians were reading it. FDR was reading it. And so there ended up being all of these letters that were sent in to Yank in response to Trimmingham's letter. And what's really interesting is the Army had a strict policy of racial segregation. The entire military did. It was the official viewpoint of many high-ranking people that it was not the time to try to integrate forces. It was too much. We needed to just focus on the war. So we needed to have complete racial segregation. Well, when you go overseas and fight, war is chaos. You're not going to be enforcing racial segregation on the battlefield. And what happened is a lot of segregated units became integrated units, and they realized that they fight very well side by side. And they realized we have an awful lot in common. And they felt they had one enemy, which was, Germany or Japan, depending on who they were fighting. And when they read Trimmingham's letter, they just thought, this is ridiculous. Like, here we are fighting overseas, and we see that we are all fighting against the same thing, and then at home, we're fighting against each other. And so there were all of these letters that were written in saying, this is ridiculous. We're doing all of this hard work overseas, and they're ruining it for us on the home front. One of my favorite letters that came in to Yank, the man said, I'm a Southern rebel, but I will be the first to admit that I do not agree with having racial segregation, and I do not want to come home to that. And so what was really beautiful about Yank is that because it printed letters in response, you had this dialogue happening across the world, really, among Americans, talking about different things, sometimes as silly as, the raincoats are terrible and they leak all the time, to, whether we should have racial integration in the military.